Steve Martin is a really famous comedian, but he's got some serious problems with other actors. Behind all his funny jokes and nice smile, Martin got really annoyed with some people he had to work with on movie sets. For years, he didn't talk about how mad he was. But now, we're finally hearing the truth. Let's talk about the 6 actors Steve Martin said he really didn't like working with the most. When Steve Martin, Chevy Chase, and Martin Short worked together in the 1986 movie Three Amigos, people watching saw 3 funny famous guys making big laughs in a cowboy-style silly movie. On the movie screen, they looked like they got along great. 3 goofy actors from old movies who accidentally got stuck in a real fight. But when the cameras weren't rolling, things weren't going so well. For Steve Martin, making the movie became less about having fun with friends and more about trying not to get too mad, especially when he had to work with Chevy Chase. Martin came to work like a good student. He showed up ready, knew what he was supposed to say, and wanted to follow the script that he helped write with Randy Newman and Lorne Michaels. For Martin, having rules was super important. Being funny wasn't just about making jokes. It was about getting the timing right, about trusting the words that had been carefully written down. But Chevy Chase liked to do things his own way. He was already famous from Saturday Night Live and movies like Caddyshack and Fletch, and Chevy had a reputation in Hollywood for being really smart but hard to work with. He often didn't like when people told him what to do, didn't like following rules, and was really good at changing scenes right when they were filming. On Three Amigos, everyone knew Chevy was like this. He kept changing his lines, added jokes that weren't in the script, and even stopped filming to throw in his own jokes to try to get more laughs for himself. Some people might have thought this was cool improvising, but to Martin, who liked being prepared and having everything balanced, it was really annoying. He didn't yell or get in a big fight with Chevy. Steve Martin was way too calm for that. Instead, he let his angry feelings come out the only way he knew how, by making sarcastic jokes. At one point, Martin said something that showed exactly how frustrated he was. If ego was money, Chevy could buy Wall Street. He said it with a smile, but everyone who heard it knew he was being serious behind the joke. For Martin, Chevy's need to be the star of every scene wasn't about working together. It was about his big ego, turning what should have been a funny movie with 3 equal stars into a constant fight for who got the most attention. The tension didn't turn into a huge fight. There were no big screaming matches or people storming off set, but everyone could feel how uncomfortable things were. Martin Short, the 3rd amigo, often tried to keep the peace, helping Martin's professional attitude work with Chase's wild unpredictability. But the damage was already done. By the time they finished filming, Steve Martin had quietly decided he didn't want to go through that again. Hollywood, always wanting to make money from successful pairs, could have easily put Martin and Chase in more movies together. But Martin said no. While he stayed polite when people could see, he never looked for another chance to work with Chevy. To him, one movie together had been more than enough. Looking back, Three Amigos is both a movie people still love and a really interesting look at personalities that didn't get along. Steve Martin's careful, well-planned comedy met Chevy Chase's crazy, ego-driven improvising, and while people watching laughed at the final movie, making it left some hurt feelings, the difference between how the 2 men worked couldn't have been more obvious. Martin was all about discipline, a guy who treated comedy like art, where every single beat mattered. Chase was all about instinct, a performer who went after laughs no matter what, even if it meant stepping on his co-stars. For a movie that was supposed to show friendship, the irony was really sharp, because when the cameras stopped rolling, Martin and Chase were anything but close. Hollywood and comedy history are full of stories about people who don't get along, but one of the more surprising fights happened between Steve Martin, the king of controlled silliness, and Bette Midler, the dramatic queen of camp, music, and bold showmanship. Both were huge talents in their own ways, and both had reputations, for amazing audiences. But when the two came together for what should have been a night of working together and doing good things, the evening fell apart into a lesson about big egos, timing, and very different ideas about teamwork. The place was a fancy charity event, the kind of party designed to show off both star power and giving money to help people. Steve Martin had agreed to host the show alongside Bette Midler, and just like always, he came to the job with precision. He prepared a sharp, funny speech, the kind of carefully written humor that mixed making fun of things with being classy. Audiences expected nothing less from him. His stand-up career and TV appearances were built on that careful structure. For Martin, sticking to the script wasn't about being boring. It was about creating rhythm and respecting the audience's attention. But Bette Midler had a very different way of doing things. Known as the Divine Miss M, she loved doing things without planning, surprising people, and taking over the spotlight. To her, a charity event wasn't about scripts. It was about putting on a show. So as Steve started his funny speech, trying to set the comedic mood for the evening, Bette suddenly went a completely different direction. Without any warning, she stopped following the prepared script and started singing, her powerful theatrical voice filling the room, drowning out Martin's words, and basically stealing the stage. The moment was shocking for Steve Martin. It wasn't just an interruption. It was the complete mess-up of the careful balance he had worked to create. To an audience, it may have looked like two entertainers taking turns with the spotlight, but to Martin, it felt like sabotage, like his job had been reduced to nothing more than a prop in someone else's show. His humor, his timing, his very presence, things that usually got people's complete attention, were suddenly pushed aside by Midler's bigger-than-life performance. Always the perfect professional, Martin stayed polite. He didn't snap, argue, or try to take back the spotlight in that moment. Instead, he kept his cool, smiled through the chaos, and let Midler continue. But everyone could feel how tense things were. What was supposed to be a partnership in hosting had turned into a one-woman show with Martin pushed to the side. By the middle of the event, Martin had had enough. Quietly and without making a big scene, he left early, leaving behind the whirlwind of Midler's improvised takeover. His exit wasn't a tantrum. It was making a statement. A man who valued professionalism, preparation, and partnership wasn't going to stand in the background of what was supposed to be his own stage. But Martin's sharpest response didn't come in that moment, but later in writing. He made a donation to the charity, but with it he left a note that was both clever and mean. It said, "Tell Bette it came from her biggest fan." Silence. That single line captured everything he felt: disappointment, irony, and just enough sting to make his point clear. For Martin, the fight wasn't about jealousy or feeling insecure. It was about respect. He had gone into the event expecting teamwork, a balance of his refined humor and Midler's theatrical energy. What he got instead was a reminder that some performers don't share the spotlight. They eat it all up. Midler, in her typical flamboyant style, had turned what should have been a performance by two people into her own personal stage, leaving Martin on the sidelines. What happened after the fight was telling. While neither started a public feud, Martin was never the type to get into tabloid drama. The story went around Hollywood circles as an example of how even the most experienced entertainers can find themselves not getting along. Martin's biting note became the story that people remembered, a witty summary of his frustration wrapped in the kind of dry humor only he could deliver. The incident also showed the big difference between the two stars. Steve Martin, with his dedication to structure, timing, and balance, represented the craftsman's side of comedy. Bette Midler, bold, brash, and unpredictable, represented the chaotic force of performance art. Both were brilliant in their own right, but together they clashed in a way that was impossible to hide. When two comedic geniuses share the same stage, audiences expect sparks of brilliance. And often that's exactly what happens. But sometimes those sparks don't create harmony. They show just how different two artists really are. That's what happened with Steve Martin and Robin Williams, two giants of comedy who really liked each other, but whose styles could never really work together. Steve Martin had built his career on structure, precision, and being clever. His humor was weird, but disciplined, crafted with the kind of timing that left nothing to chance. Every hand movement, every pause, every punchline was carefully thought about. To watch Martin perform was to see a master craftsman at work, weaving elegance and smarts into comedy. Robin Williams, on the other hand, was like chaos and speed came to life. His mind moved faster than most people could follow, his performances exploding with making things up on the spot, doing impressions, and rapid-fire jokes. He didn't just deliver comedy. He became a whirlwind of it. Audiences loved the wild unpredictability, but to a performer who valued control, it could feel like trying to tame a storm. The two men found themselves sharing the stage for a skit that was supposed to highlight their different talents. The idea looked brilliant on paper. Martin's careful timing paired with Williams's anarchic spontaneity. But in practice, the clash was undeniable. During one particularly key moment, Williams, true to form, went off script, launching into a loud, unscripted bit that got huge laughs but completely messed up the planned rhythm. For Williams, it was magic, an organic spark in the moment. For Martin, it was chaos. The structure he had worked to build collapsed, leaving him stranded in the eye of Williams' comedic storm. Later, Martin described the experience in one of his most memorable jokes about working with his fellow comic. Performing with Robin is like reading poetry on a roller coaster. It was a line that captured everything: the awe, the admiration, and the complete confusion of trying to keep up with a man who never stopped moving. The roller coaster for Williams was freedom. For Martin, it was like being dizzy and sick. But despite the clash, there was no meanness. Martin respected Robin Williams tremendously, recognizing his raw genius and his once-in-a-generation talent. He admired the way Robin could electrify a room, spinning comedy out of thin air, leaving audiences doubled over before anyone knew what had happened. But admiration didn't mean they could work together well. After that skit, both men quietly decided it was best not to work together again. Respect stayed the same, but working together was avoided. Their difference reflected deeper truths about comedy itself. Martin represented order, the kind of comedy that required rehearsal, balance, and space to breathe. Williams embodied chaos. Comedy as an uncontrollable flood of imagination, where mistakes became punchlines, and no script was ever sacred. For audiences, both approaches were dazzling in their own ways. For performers trying to share a stage, the difference could be overwhelming. Even so, Martin never said bad things about Williams in public. His roller coaster comment was not a mean joke, but a poetic way of acknowledging what made Williams so unique. And Williams, for his part, never showed anger toward Martin. He knew his style could overwhelm others, and he respected Martin's brilliance from a distance. On screen, Steve Martin and Goldie Hawn appeared to be a match made in comedy. Heaven. Their 1992 film House Sitter charmed audiences with its mix of silly romance and quick-witted talking back and forth. To viewers, their chemistry seemed effortless. Two seasoned performers bouncing off one another with perfect comedic timing. But behind the scenes, the experience wasn't as smooth as it appeared. While there were no explosive fights or public feuds, a series of small frustrations quietly wore down Martin's enthusiasm for working with Hawn again. Steve Martin had always approached comedy with discipline. His background in stand-up and years of carefully practiced routines gave him a performer's respect for timing, rehearsal, and preparation. To him, a scene wasn't just about saying lines, it was about rhythm, about the invisible structure that made comedy land precisely when it should. Goldie Hawn, by contrast, thrived on spontaneity. She had built her reputation on bubbly charm, improvisational wit, and an instinct for capturing an audience in the moment. That looseness made her magnetic, but to Martin it sometimes felt reckless. On the set of House Sitter, their different styles quickly became obvious. Martin would arrive early, script in hand, rehearsed and ready. Hawn often came late, sometimes breezing in with the kind of casual confidence that only a star of her level could carry. She liked to improvise, throwing in extra lines or gestures not in the script. To her, it kept things fresh and unpredictable. To Martin, it risked messing up the careful timing he relied on. He admired her talent, but the unpredictability bothered him. The tension got worse off set in more subtle ways. At a party during the film's production, Martin brought out his banjo, an instrument he didn't just play, but loved deeply. Music, particularly bluegrass, was one of his deepest passions, a craft he treated with as much seriousness as his comedy. As he played, Goldie, ever playful, made a light-hearted joke at his expense. For her, it was harmless teasing in a social setting. For Martin, it hurt. He was known for his self-making fun of himself humor on stage, but in private, his music was sacred ground. That joke, small as it was, stayed with him. None of these moments turned into arguments. Martin remained polite and professional, and Hawn continued to sparkle both on and off screen, but small hurts have a way of adding up. By the end of filming, Martin had come to a quiet conclusion. As much as audiences loved their pairing, he didn't want to repeat the experience. When offers came up later for the two to reunite on other projects, Martin declined. To outsiders, it seemed puzzling. Why wouldn't he want to work again with a partner who had delivered box office charm? To those who knew him, the answer was simple. Martin valued harmony, and with Hawn, he hadn't found it. In interviews, Martin never spoke harshly about Hawn. He didn't air his complaints publicly, nor did he diminish her talent. His criticisms, if voiced at all, were private and understated, but his actions spoke volumes. Hollywood thrives on proven pairings, and had Martin been willing, he and Hawn might have enjoyed multiple collaborations. Instead, House Sitter remained their one significant movie together. In the world of comedy, rivalries often simmer beneath the surface. What audiences see on stage or screen is laughter, friendship, and effortless timing. But behind the curtain, egos, tempers, and clashing personalities can shape careers and relationships. For Steve Martin, known for his meticulous approach to comedy and polished professionalism, one of his most bitter clashes came with none other than Bill Murray, a man whose unpredictable, rebellious spirit defined him just as much as his humor. The incident that sparked the rift took place during a live sketch performance in the late 1970s, when both men were at the height of their creative powers. Steve Martin, fresh off his wildly successful stand-up tours and Saturday Night Live appearances, had crafted a reputation for being not only hilariously original, but also perfectly disciplined. He believed in preparation, being on time, and respect for the craft. Bill Murray, on the other hand, carried a reputation that was almost the complete opposite. Brilliant on stage, yes, but also notorious for his bad temper, his lateness, and his tendency to test boundaries just for the sake of it. On that awful night, Murray showed up nearly an hour late to a live sketch performance. To Martin, who had been rehearsing, timing the cues, and making sure that everything would run smoothly, it was more than just unprofessional. It was an insult, and Murray didn't stop there. Once he finally arrived, he openly made fun of Martin's famously clean-cut style, turning what should have been a shared comedic triumph into a battle of attitudes. The laughter from the audience only made the hurt. Worse for Martin, who stood on stage not as a partner, but as the target of Murray's unscripted mean jokes. The tension was never openly explosive, but it cut deep. The audience may not have noticed the rift beneath the performance, but for Martin, trust had been broken. Comedy is built on rhythm, and rhythm is built on reliability. Without it, timing collapses, And in Martin's eyes, Murray had sabotaged both the moment and their friendship. What followed was years of silence. After that night, the two comedians didn't speak for over a decade. The comedy world, surprisingly small at the top, kept placing them in the same circles. But the two men treated each other like strangers. Even at major industry events, such as the Cannes Film Festival years later, where one might expect old colleagues to at least exchange polite words, they remained deliberately apart. No nods of acknowledgement, no backstage conversations, just a visible and intentional distance. Part of the rift came from their completely different philosophies about work. Steve Martin valued professionalism above all else. For him, showing up on time, respecting rehearsal schedules, and treating every gig, whether a live sketch, a television taping, or a film set, as serious work was non-negotiable. Bill Murray, on the other hand, embodied the chaos of improvisation. He thrived on spontaneity, sometimes at the expense of others. To his defenders, that chaos was part of his genius. To Martin, it was recklessness pretending to be charm. The irony of their falling out is that both men were giants of their generation, shaping comedy in ways that still matter today. Steve Martin brought sophistication and a unique absurdist edge to American humor, while Murray filled it with an anarchic energy that broke rules and electrified audiences. Together they might have created unforgettable work. Instead, the silent feud meant that what could have been a legendary pairing never fully happened. The clash between Bill Murray and Steve Martin wasn't marked by shouting matches or public insults, but by the kind of quiet break that says more than words ever could. It was a professional relationship cut off not by a single joke, but by a violation of trust, something Martin, a perfectionist to his core, could never overlook. For him, Murray's lateness and mockery weren't just bad behavior. They were signs of disrespect for the very craft that defined their lives. Years later, comedy historians and fans alike would look back on that rift with a sense of what might have been. While both men went on to extraordinary careers, their paths rarely crossed in any meaningful way again, and perhaps that was inevitable. Martin and Murray represented two poles of comedy: discipline versus chaos, structure versus spontaneity. When those poles collided on stage, the laughter was real, but so was the fallout. Award shows are meant to be nights of celebration, a chance for comedians to honor one another while giving audiences a taste of the humor that made them famous. But sometimes those stages reveal more than laughter. They expose rivalries, frustrations, and clashing philosophies of comedy. One of the most striking examples came at a comedy awards show in the 1990s, when Jim Carrey and Steve Martin found themselves sharing a stage, and the result was anything but harmonious. Jim Carrey, then riding the high of his Ace Ventura, The Mask, and Dumb and Dumber stardom, was like manic energy came to life. He dominated stages with rubber-faced expressions, wild voices, and over-the-top impressions that seemed endless in supply. Audiences loved the chaos. But to a seasoned performer like Steve Martin, who valued discipline, structure, and the elegance of well-timed comedy, Carrey's approach often felt more like a storm than a craft. That divide came to a head during Carrey's acceptance speech. Given the microphone, Carrey launched into what was supposed to be a brief thank you. Instead, it became a 14-minute free-for-all. He cycled through impressions of Clint Eastwood, Jimmy Stewart, Elvis Presley, and even his fellow comedians in the room. He made silly faces. He shouted. He stretched the bit until the audience didn't know whether to laugh or cringe. What started as entertaining slowly drifted into showing off, the kind of performance that seemed to eat up the room rather than make it better. Steve Martin, seated near the front, grew visibly restless. Ever the professional, he valued keeping things short at events like this, understanding that awards shows ran on tight schedules, and that comedy above all needed rhythm. Watching Carrey hijack the moment with unchecked improvisation bothered him. Finally, in a move that drew the audience's attention, Martin let out a loud, exaggerated yawn. Then, to everyone's surprise, he walked up on stage holding a comically oversized "Wrap It Up" sign. The crowd erupted in laughter, convinced it was a bit. Two comedy legends orchestrating a playful gag. But it wasn't. Behind Martin's polite smile was genuine irritation. He had broken one of his own golden rules of performance. Never let the audience see the frustration. Because Carrey's disregard for structure had simply pushed him too far. Later, Martin explained the moment in honest terms. He respected Carrey's talent but found his style exhausting. Working with Jim, Martin admitted, felt like comedy chaos. To Martin, comedy was about balance, about knowing when to step back and when to push forward. Carrey, on the other hand, only knew how to push further, louder, wilder. The clash didn't end at the awards show. Hollywood insiders later revealed that Martin had been approached to star in a potential buddy comedy film opposite Carrey. On paper, it seemed like a dream pairing. Two comedic icons from different eras thrown together for fireworks. But when Martin learned that Carrey was attached, he declined. The memory of the awards show and the fear of enduring months of the same unrelenting energy was enough to make him walk away. "It wouldn't work," he confided to friends. "We're oil and water." In hindsight, their clash was almost inevitable. Steve Martin had always represented the polished side of comedy: clever wordplay, absurdist precision, and carefully constructed routines. Jim Carrey embodied the opposite: raw energy, improvisation without limits, and comedy as spectacle. For audiences, both styles worked brilliantly on their own. Together, though, they created friction instead of harmony. To Carrey fans, the awards show performance was pure Jim, fearless, unfiltered, and larger than life. To Martin, it was a reminder of why he valued discipline above all else. Comedy wasn't just about making people laugh. It was about making them laugh in a way that lasted, that didn't wear out its welcome. Carrey's chaos might have burned brighter in the moment, but for Martin, it risked burning out everything around it. The two never developed a close relationship. While they remained publicly respectful, Martin never launched into insults, and Carrey never attacked him back. The distance was clear. Hollywood tried more than once to imagine them together, but Martin's reluctance never softened. The awards show had left too strong an impression. What do you think about the 6 co-stars that Steve Martin hates? Leave us your comments in the section below. We hope you have found this helpful video. Don't forget to leave a like, share, and subscribe to the channel if you like it. Thank you for watching this, and see you in the next videos. Goodbye.